Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 29, JEDP and the 30 or so 10 Commandments. Good to be back, gang. Happy 2026. I'm finally feeling better. My voice is finally mostly better. We are back at it. Last time, I went over the fallout of Jerusalem's destruction and some of the initial reactions to it. The exiled prophet Ezekiel, among the more unsavory characters in biblical history, emerged as one of our most esoteric and visionary prophets so far, but his criticism of the Jerusalem elites utilized extreme levels of patriarchal violence to make their point, so that's a tough one. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar had moved on from kicking Egypt out to besieging the Phoenician coast in the 670s. Babylon, in part because it didn't exist for very long, does not give us many great sources for its political history, but its shadow hangs heavily over the Bible. Not just in the story of the exile, though we'll get to that, but also in the Babylonian background to some of the most famous mythology of the Bible, especially a story written to explain why we all speak different languages, the famous Tower of Babel story. Babylon, again, ain't going to be around long. There is an absurd amount of background for the Bible to cover in such a short period of time, so wish me luck. Much of this episode is going to cover what's called the documentary hypothesis. This is sort of a special episode. Something I've alluded to on the show before is that the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of basically every Bible, is made up of at least 4 sources that scholars can broadly identify and argue over, with the theoretical sources nicknamed J, E, D, and P. I'll be introducing you to all of that in some detail today. This was a particularly difficult episode to write, since probably the easiest way to see the sources is to simply look at a color-coded version of the Pentateuch, which you can and should do, and which I've linked in the description for this episode. But since this is an audio medium, I've tried to construct the episode in such a way that I zero in on individual portions of the Torah that I think best demonstrate the fractures between the sources. So if you understand at least half of what I'm saying by the end of the episode, then I've done my job. There's a chart on the Patreon and Instagram post for this episode, as well as on my Twitter and Blue Sky accounts, which shows the overall layout of the hypothesis in a handy visual representation, so make sure to check that out before or after you listen to the episode. Today's main sources are David Carr's The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11, Carr's Genesis 1 through 11 Critical Commentary, Joel Baden's The Composition of the Pentateuch, and a whole lot of other books, videos, and articles listed in the bibliography portion below. There's a great YouTube video from David Carr that goes over the state of scholarship for the documentary hypothesis, so all of you real nerds out there who want a concise summary can check that out. As always, thank you to all of my supporters at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast who make this show possible. There are many ways one can divide up the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are how they're divided up in most Bibles, and that's not the worst partition one could make, but there are visible seams and fault lines and repetitions that indicate we could go even further. Exodus through Deuteronomy is almost entirely focused on Moses and the broader story of the Israelites, and so there's some kind of general division there. But also think about all of the little stories we've covered along the way that acted as background sources for the Pentateuch. Think about how the flood story was incorporated almost wholesale from Atrahasis into the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then later 2 different interwoven versions of Noah's take on this flood story got put into Genesis 6 through 9. Think of the laws of Hammurabi that inform the Covenant Code starting in Exodus 20 and that go on for a few chapters after that. Think of the Treaty of Esarhaddon that shines through in a few places in Deuteronomy. Think of the Balaam prophecies and narrative that finds its background in some legendary early Iron Age folklore figure. It gets even more bonkers and even more complicated than all of this. Let's take a look at a particularly egregious example of a fracture in the text to really hammer this point home. It's a story that will be familiar to anyone who's seen Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, or the pretty okay sequel to The Prince of Egypt, Joseph, King of Dreams, an animated film where Ben Affleck plays the biblical patriarch.
Let me go! You don't understand. I'm from the house of Jacob.
A little scrawny, isn't he?
The overall yarn is that Joseph, One of the sons of Jacob, aka Israel, the patriarch, is designated as Jacob's favored son and, well, God's favored son of Jacob.
Our baby brother, he is special, he is one of us, we'll keep him from harm.
And this makes all the other sons, representing the other 11 tribes of Israel, jealous. Their jealousy reaches a boiling point as Joseph is given visions from God himself and a magnificent coat, a fashionable reminder of his closeness to the divine. In the various film and stage versions, what happens next is usually smoothed over. Joseph is typically thrown into a pit and then sold to traders who come along. But the text found in Genesis is not so clear. Let's read it in detail just to get a baseline. It starts with Joseph going to visit his brothers who are working out in a distant field. The brothers see him and, fed up with his bullshit, decide to kill him. That's when things get a little funky. Quote from Genesis 37. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save Joseph from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down for a meal. So far, so good. Nothing too weird yet. Let's continue. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt.
Someone's extracted all the latinum! There's nothing here but worthless gold!
And it's all yours.
Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. But let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. End quote. So here we hit a little bit of weirdness. We have both Judah and Reuben making what seems to be separate attempts to save Joseph from being killed. Judah says to sell him to the Ishmaelites. Reuben says to throw him into a pit. But then something really, really odd happens in the next verse. Quote, "When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt." Suddenly, out of nowhere, a group of Midianites appears. Remember, Judah wanted to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who had just appeared, but as it reads, the Midianites seem to pull Joseph up out of the pit, or perhaps some unknown they, maybe the brothers, and then this they immediately sells Joseph to the Ishmaelites instead, and it gets even weirder. Joseph is gone and his father weeps when his other sons invent a cockamamie story about a wild animal tearing Joseph's colorful coat to shreds and leaving with his body. His father, of course, is Jacob, aka Israel, who repeatedly tricks and deceives people with Yahweh's help, and the Jewish Study Bible notes a bitter irony here that Jacob has been himself deceived and in the worst way possible. Not even his son's body is recovered, spelling a terrible fate for his wandering remains that cannot be reunited with his ancestors in Sheol. But after this, at the end of chapter 37, we get the stinger, quote, "And Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward." Now, hold on, you say. Didn't the Midianites sell him to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph down to Egypt? Isn't that literally what it said like 8 verses back? Hey, how did the Midianites get back into the story? And then if you flip forward past chapter 38 to 39, you're greeted in the first verse to this, quote, "When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there." That's right, the Ishmaelites are back too, and now they are the ones selling Joseph to Potiphar. What a mess. Joel Baden uses this as part of his introduction to his book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, which I had completely forgotten until rereading it during a rewrite for this episode. It was not my intention to borrow from Baden. I've long found this passage to be fascinating and illuminating for the documentary hypothesis, but I thought I should call it out, since the last thing I need is a plagiarism accusation. Baden traces the entire history of trying to sort the Joseph story out. particularly who did what to Joseph and then who sold him to whom. In the earliest retellings of the story, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the conflicting details are just sort of cut out and smoothed over, somewhat like the versions you find in modern movies and plays. A couple centuries later, however, the rabbis tried their hands at it, but instead of smoothing it over, they invent a fascinating chain of various Ishmaelite and Midianite traders who sort of bucket brigade Joseph down to Egypt, selling him over and over again, which I think is incredibly funny and a great way to handle the problem. The rabbis love the sort of yes and improvisation. Later interpreters posited that the Ishmaelites were the same as the Midianites, and that's less fun. Not true, and doesn't really solve all the redundancy and weirdness. Over the last couple of centuries, though, scholars have developed a really interesting idea. What if this confusing Joseph story is actually two Joseph stories, telling a slightly different version of the same tale, in which were somewhat haphazardly merged together? If we take seriously that this is two versions woven together, they can be separated out like this. In one version, let's call it E for simplicity's sake, we get something like this. The brothers conspire to kill Joseph. Reuben convinces them to throw Joseph in the pit out in the wilderness instead, likely intending to retrieve him later. While the brothers are enjoying their plowman's lunch and having a laugh about their hilarious prank on their brother, some Midianite traders discover Joseph in the pit and steal him, taking him down to Egypt and selling him to Potiphar. In the other version, let's call it J instead of E, it doesn't go down like that. J, which seems to be the more complete story, maybe the second one written, instead has Judah as the good brother who tries to save Joseph. But instead of throwing him in a pit, he sees some Ishmaelite traders wandering by and sells Joseph into slavery to save him from death, inventing the story of the beast and bringing back his bloody coat to convince their father he's dead. The E version with the Midianites is not as detailed, which probably means that when these stories were combined, it was also probably the one that was pared down. But because whoever combined these stories seems to have found both of them to be important, they still include the little notice at the end that it was the Midianites, not the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph down to Egypt and sold him to Potiphar. If we tease them apart, the story, or rather stories, are a lot clearer, even if we can't quite understand why they would combine them in this fashion. When you view the Bible through this kind of lens, it doesn't solve everything, but it can help you to understand just why, when you were a kid, so much of it was either kind of confusing or didn't make a lick of goddamn sense. Some of the Bible's repetitiveness and its mundane details are intentional. Think about the genealogies. There's a point to them. But there are actual narrative problems caused by this merging of sources. Why these scribes did it this way, who they were trying to please with their inclusions, whether it was a group decision or just one guy, whether some of the sources were compiled together before they were put into the Torah. When any of this happened, those are the realm of argument for scholars to this day. The main point, though, is that it wasn't just you as a kid struggling to understand this stuff. Sometimes the way these different segments were put together is kind of a mess. And the story of just how Joseph ended up in slavery is an especially clear example of how that can result in weird, idiosyncratic readings in the text as we have it today. Usually the way these sources were woven together is not quite as bizarre as the Joseph kidnapping tale. That is a particularly tricky passage, and more often it's similar to what we see at the very beginning of Genesis. This is an example of source criticism. We've gone over this without calling it source criticism a few times on this show. I may have mentioned the documentary hypothesis once or twice before, but today we're getting into it. One of our earliest examples of source criticism is the flood myth of Atrahasis, a story whose earliest physical examples date back to the early 2nd millennium BCE. We have tablets from that time period that have the myth in them. Much later, scholars have found it incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh as a flashback, even later when it was incorporated and adapted into Genesis. This is an example of source criticism. Imagine 50 years from now, you're writing a history of hip-hop. Among one of the first generations, you find the highly influential song Straight Outta Compton by NWA.
Straight out of Compton, crazy motherfucker named Ice Cube.
This song, along with dozens and even hundreds of others, contains the famous Amen drum break sample from the 1969 soul track Amen Brother. If you were a scholar in the future, you could use this along with many other soul and R&B samples as evidence not only for Amen Brother being the older track, but for the influence of this kind of music on hip-hop. Of course, hip-hop has continued to accrete influences from rock, poetry, electronica, and even country, and yet we can see this early and prominent influence from soul. In the modern era, you can of course also rely on quotes from hip-hop artists themselves on the influence from older black music, but you'd hardly need that if somehow all of these interviews disappeared in the future, as long as you had the date for the creation of these songs. The evidence of influence from Amen Brother into hip-hop is rather clear, and so is evidence for the direction of the influence. Amen Brother is the older song. The Torah is a bit weirder than that, though, because these sources are all hypothetical, and we don't know for certain which parts are older. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are often described as the primeval history portion of the book. It's a mix between two of our sources, the E source and the P source. Something noteworthy is that most of the characters and events described here don't really appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses are all over the Hebrew Bible, but Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah and the flood, there are occasional references to some of them, but comparatively very, very few. And again, dating these texts is notoriously difficult. One example of something that kinda looks like Genesis 1 through 11 from our current moment in the early mid-500s is a curious passage in Ezekiel 28 that references the Garden of Eden. Ezekiel is in the middle of castigating the kingdom of Tyre on the Lebanese coast, as he is wont to do, in an oracle where he celebrates their partial destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. The wealthy port city, in the prophet's view, is the symbol of excess and debauchery. Whether this was simply his moralizing view based on what he'd heard of the city, or whether he was mad that Tyre allied with the Egyptians to resist Babylon, is unknown. But for whatever reason, he was mad at them. And so he says that they made themselves out to be the very gods, but look at how bad they're doing now that the land part of their city is in ruins. They would likely retort that at least they had a capital to remain in, but we don't get their reply. All we get is Ezekiel, quote, "Will you still say, 'I am a god,' before your slayers, when you are proved a man, not a god, at the hands of those who strike you down? By the hands of strangers you shall die." All right, pal, calm it down a bit. But he goes on, quote, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and flawless in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your adornment. Carnelian, chrysolite, and amethyst, beryl, lapis lazuli, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald, and gold, beautifully wrought for you, mined for you, prepared the day you were created. I created you as a cherub, with outstretched, shielding wings." Okay, so starting off with something interesting here, Eden is here described as containing precious jewels and stones. While the Genesis version does mention precious metals and stones in the various rivers that flow from Eden, the version here is more similar to the Garden of Delights at the edge of the world in the Epic of Gilgamesh, something he encounters just before he sets sail for Noah, or Utnapishtim, who resides beyond the shores at the edge of the bit of waters, yada, yada, yada. But then there's something else as Ezekiel's poem goes on. Quote, "And you resided on God's holy mountain. You walked among stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until wrongdoing was found in you. By your far-flung commerce you were filled with lawlessness, and you sinned. So I have struck you down from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O shielding cherub, from among the stones of fire." Now, this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. First, Tyre is near the mountainous region of Lebanon, and here, God's garden is said to lie on top of a mountain, perhaps a similar location to the Mountain of the Gods, where Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight Humbaba. Remember that? This is not something spelled out in Genesis 2 when it describes Eden's location, But Genesis's version of Eden does say that the garden is the source of the 4 great waters of the earth. In coded language, it seems to refer to the Red Sea, the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. And that likely implies mountainous geography. They thought that mountains were where all rivers came from, and they were kind of right. It's a whole thing. The mountains of the gods were often placed at the source of the Nile or the Tigris and the Euphrates. And to the author of Genesis 2, at the center of this impossible linkage of 4 waters lay Eden, lending it an obvious folkloric, mythic quality. My friend Paul Davidson over at the Inquisitive Bible Reader did a great video on the location of Eden that I'll link below. Seriously, you've got to check out the episode descriptions. I always put lots of good stuff in there. But what's also fascinating in Ezekiel's Eden story is who's there and who's not there. Adam and Eve, never mentioned. He uses the Eden motif again to excoriate the Egyptians in chapter 31, just 3 chapters later, and again, no Adam and Eve. This might owe to the fact that they're barely more than functional characters in the Genesis story. I mean, their names literally mean man and woman. But it also possibly speaks to a late date for the Adam and Eve story. In Adam and Eve's place, we don't even get a snake in Ezekiel. He's not there either. Instead, Tyre is represented as one of the cherubim, the Lamassu-style chimeric beasts. And in the second part of the poem, he's cowering and is killed and thrown out of the garden. The little Ezekiel story is a fascinating glimpse into other versions and plays on familiar mythology, either Ezekiel's own interpretation or possibly older, wider traditions that have been lost to time. But there's something else to the Garden of Eden story in Genesis, related to the fact that Adam and Eve are never mentioned again. It's probably the older of the 2 creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. This is one of those supreme oddities, because many scholars of the documentary hypothesis, the one that theorizes sources such as J and E from earlier, believe that these sources are from the 8th or 7th centuries, during the later years of the kingdoms of Samaria and Jerusalem. Many in the 20th century argued they go back even further into the 11th, 10th, or 9th centuries. But if that's true, why doesn't Adam start showing up in other texts until the 4th and 3rd centuries? And again, that's from the older of the 2 Genesis creation stories. The younger one, which runs through Genesis 1, comes from what is called the priestly or P source. You'll recall Genesis 1 is famously starting, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, Let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." And then do that 5 more times before having the rest. You remember all that. It's a nice and neat creation story that goes through each day and each part of existence in a tidy fashion before emphasizing God's rest for the Sabbath, ending in the opening verses of chapter 2. This, again, comes from the priestly source, P, one of the later sources. The hypothesized division of sources in the Pentateuch is, again, called the documentary hypothesis, named for the 4 documents that many scholars argue lie behind the Pentateuch. These sources are the priestly source, or P, usually agreed to be the latest of the 4 main sources. P essentially runs the entire length of the Torah, and is the one thing almost all scholars agree exists. It starts in Genesis 1, continues throughout Genesis, provides alternate accounts of the Exodus, comprises most or all of Leviticus, around half or more of the book of Numbers, and continues through a few small portions of Deuteronomy, and maybe, some scholars argue, into parts of Joshua beyond the bounds of the Torah. It also contains its own law code, called the Holiness Code, which serves to standardize care of Yahweh in the temple, and features much of the pure versus impure or pure versus polluted language that I discussed with Eve Feinstein back in episodes 18 and 19. If it wasn't clear from that overview, P is very obviously the largest of our sources, and you can kind of read it on its own. Leanne Feldman created a full account and translation of the priestly source with an introduction and some commentary in a book called The Consuming Fire, which she also kindly made available as a pretty cheap paperback. Go check it out. It's great. P is sometimes called the spine of the Torah, since it is the most complete of all the sources, and it contains a lot of the material that links the stories together. But one thing Feldman points out is that P does not have a story of Joseph going to Egypt, one of the few big missing links. Those kind of gaps do make some scholars wonder if it was ever truly independent, or if it was always meant to tie everything together. But then there are many parts where a later hand seems to have tied P into other parts of the Torah, so we're once again just left kind of shrugging our shoulders here. The other big-ass source in the Torah, and the other source the overwhelming majority of scholars agree exists, is called D for Deuteronomist, so named because, well, most of the D material is in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy itself is composed of mostly D material. I find Deuteronomy to be a fascinating book because it's framed almost entirely as the farewell speech of Moses himself before his death or ascension to the realm of the gods, in which he provides a rallying cry to the gathered people of all Israel. It contains what appears to be some very old poetry, especially the Song of Moses, that famous poem which seems to point to Yahweh as a subservient god to El Elyon, the great father god of the pantheon, in Deuteronomy 32. You remember that this is also the book with a lot of influence from the treaty covenant of Esarhaddon, the king who was so nervous about the succession of his son Ashurbanipal. But in Deuteronomy's version, the jealous king is not a mere man, but Yahweh himself, and he details to Moses many of the cultic and behavioral norms that he expects from his people. D seems to be the one who turns all of these ideas of laws into a big general concept, a vassal treaty, but not between kings as brothers or fathers and sons, or a king and his people as a father and a son. Nor are these laws exactly like Hammurabi's code, gifted by the god, but not in a direct covenant with his people. This capital L law, this concept of Torah, as a covenant between the people and their God, this is D's literary innovation. It's not necessarily found throughout the Torah, despite it being so influential. And influences on this conception are obvious, but there's a distinct development in this idea of a legal covenant between Yahweh and Israel, a framework that will develop even further as the centuries progress. But for now, it's a covenant between Yahweh and his people, mediated through this founding hero, Moses. This concept of the Torah as a kind of Iron Age legal contract seems to have influenced writers and redactors of what I've referred to as the Deuteronomistic history throughout the show. That's why the story of Israel and Judah as kingdoms is told the way that it is. It's a sort of narrative exploration of this concept of the covenant between Yahweh and the monarchies. The idea of a kind of Deuteronomistic school is also pretty popular in some scholarly circles, with books like Ezekiel and parts of Jeremiah and several others posited as containing distinctly Deuteronomistic language. And so perhaps there was some circle of scholars who all shared these kind of ideas. I'm not going to go into all of that today, but I figured I'd better mention it. So most or all of Leviticus is P, half of Numbers is P with large sections inserted by a later redactor that isn't related to any of the proposed sources. Most of Deuteronomy is D, and that leaves us with Genesis and Exodus, and that's where things get really tricky. There's a lot of P in there too. Again, P is what seems to tie all of this together.
That rug really tied the room together, did it not?
Fucking A.
This guy peed on it.
Donnie, please.
So we've got P and D. Those are the main things scholars agree on. Scholars also generally agree on a few other sections and direct influences that stick out. There's the Holiness Code, which makes up much of Leviticus, that has some kind of relationship with the priestly source, either as a law code, which the narrative was framed around, or as a later insertion. And there's obviously the Covenant Code, based on Hammurabi, found in Exodus 20, which may have helped frame the J and E sources, our remaining two sources. And obviously, much of D is influenced by Esarhaddon's Oath and Succession Treaty. See, we are starting to put together a whole lot of what we've talked about on the show so far. I told you we'd get here. Now, people have long noticed the fractures and redundancies in the Torah. Early rabbis around the time of Jesus found great meaning and opportunity for commentary in these contradictions and doublets and oddities. Later scholars argued for potential corruptions or changes or even mistakes in the text to some degree. But the Reformation is when things really get going, because that provided a window for questioning traditions about the Bible that helped spur the Enlightenment and a deluge of free philosophical inquiry. Over the years, the unity of the Bible was questioned in increasingly radical and, to some, heretical ways. While Moses had been traditionally considered the author of most of the Torah, which isn't ever stated in the text, some early Christians and Jews had seen much of the original creation story as allegorical to an extent. Still, most rabbis and scholars for a long time believed in the historicity of at least the patriarchal narratives, the overall Exodus story, and Moses' authorship of most of the Torah outside of the passages that go beyond the time of his death. By the 19th century, most of that was up for grabs, with varying levels of historicity granted to the Pentateuch, less and less as the centuries have gone on. With this new view came the ability to see these fractures in the Torah through exclusively narrative eyes, without a need to defend theological or historical implications, and scholars began hypothesizing about just how the books of the Torah came together. The general model for the documentary hypothesis that held the majority view for the 19th and much of the 20th century was created by a German scholar called Julius Wellhausen in the late 1800s based on some earlier work that similarly theorized different background sources. Over time, Wellhausen's framework was developed even further, giving us the four sources as scholars conceive of them today. P, which goes through the entire Torah, D, which is confined to Deuteronomy and a bit beyond, and which makes up most of Deuteronomy, and then our last two sources, E and J. I've told the story of the documentary hypothesis this way very intentionally, because the last two sources have been disputed to exist. There's a fracture in biblical scholarship that generally splits between scholars in continental Europe and scholars who are mostly confined to the United States. There are some American and European turncoats who bat for the other team, but that generally describes the layout of the opposing views. Europeans are more likely to doubt the existence of E and J, while American scholars have continued along the path that Wellhausen laid out. For now, despite my lack of patriotism, I'll stick with the modern version of the classic documentary hypothesis. The remaining two sources in this model, as you might have guessed, are E, the Elohist, and J, the Yahwist, since Yahweh starts with a soft J in German.
The name of God, Jehovah.
But in the Latin alphabet, Jehovah begins with an I.
E and J are the two sources I mentioned earlier in the Joseph kidnapping slavery story, a story that the P source, curiously, does not contain. Despite going from creation through the flood, through the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through the Exodus and the Moses story, maybe even into Joshua, P just does not explain how Joseph ends up in Egypt. Sometimes P can be thought of as an independent source that was written under the influence of the other sources, but if that's true, we seem to be missing parts of it. Or was it written to tie everything together and therefore assumes the existence of J and E? It's hard to say. There are a lot of things we don't quite understand about the composition of the Pentateuch because we get our earliest manuscripts probably a fair bit after it was compiled, at least decades, if not centuries, after the sources were first put together into one long narrative. Our first manuscripts are, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their earliest fragments are from the mid-2nd to maybe late 3rd century BCE. At this point in the story, in the 570s BCE, 300 years earlier or more, we have exactly one tiny bit of something physical that resembles one part of the text of the Torah. That's it. They're called the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, but the term scroll might be a bit misleading. These aren't big pieces of parchment or paper that can be rolled and unrolled whenever you want to read them. They're silver amulets that were worn around the neck. They were found at an archaeological gravesite dig outside of Jerusalem about 45 years ago. They were carefully and slowly unrolled and scanned, and the magic words on them were somewhat familiar to Hebrew Bible scholars. The first one ends something like this: May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine on you. It bears some resemblance to similar blessings in a few parts of the Hebrew Bible. The second one reads something like this: May he be blessed by Yahweh, the helper and rebuker of evil. May he bless you, Yahweh, may he keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. This is rather similar to a blessing that Yahweh tells Moses to give to Aaron and his sons in the book of Numbers in the Torah. Quote from Numbers 6. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh shine his face upon you and grant you peace. This isn't important to remember, but that is supposedly from the priestly source. While confessional websites and resources will talk about how the Ketef Hinnom scrolls demonstrate astonishing accuracy in the transmission of the biblical texts, there are some clear differences between the two, and it seems rather likely that this somewhat generic blessing was an important one, perhaps even a pre-exilic bit of liturgy from the temple itself, from the priests themselves. A version of it was inserted into this part of the Torah, albeit in a completely different context from our tomb amulet, and obviously with significant differences. In fact, the closing benediction in both of the tiny scrolls, the part about Yahweh blessing you and Yahweh's face shining upon you, probably dates back to around the 9th century or earlier, near the beginning of Yahweh's time on the scene. Since the Ketef Hinnom scrolls were likely never designed to be unrolled at all, their function seems to have been as magical amulets designed to keep the wearer protected by these sacred words in this life and also in Sheol, the great beyond below, hence being found among the tombs. There are similar inscriptions in graves and on buildings that are also generic. Quote from one found in a cave tomb about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem: Yahweh is the God of the whole earth. The highlands of Judah belong to the God of Jerusalem. Unquote. Pretty standard epithets and benedictions, blessings from Yahweh and his Asherah, stuff like that. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls, despite being wonderful pieces of archaeology, can only tell us that something like what came down to us in Numbers existed as a blessing around this time, along with a whole bunch of other stuff that didn't make it into the Bible. But they do help make the case that parts of the Torah, while extremely idealized and ascribed to much older figures, could record some aspect of real ritual in the pre-exilic royal cult especially. There's a whole lot about ritual and physical cult among the texts of the Torah, and while we don't get anything near the level of detail that comes in the Talmudic descriptions of the specific cultic practices of the Second Temple, they tell you, okay, the priest goes in here and he does this and he says this and he gives these specific words. We don't get anything like that. But if we allow ourselves to understand the Torah as being related heavily to the care of Yahweh as it existed in the First and early Second Temple periods, we can begin to understand why it was recorded. That it was attributed to figures from so long ago and has come down to us in this redactional and difficult-to-date text severely limits our ability to understand the proper context, but the visibility is still there. There's something to this, some relationship to real ritual, even if it's often abstracted and seen through fogged-up lenses. The fact that it's complicated by the idea of multiple sources only increases the confusion. Made worse, of course, by the fact that this is it. This is all we get for physical evidence of the text of the Torah until the 2nd century. Hell, it's practically nothing. The quotation of the Baal cycle in Isaiah 27, where it talks about killing Leviathan, is about as long as the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. And that's from the end of the Late Bronze Age, over 600 years before our present moment. Legitimately, before the 2nd century, we have as much quotation in the Bible from texts that are foreign to it than we do of texts in the Bible. The point I'm making is that everything I say here needs to be understood as hypothetical. The documentary hypothesis is a very good hypothesis. It utilizes source criticism, it takes into account textual production in a physical sense, and so it resembles other examples of textual composition and editing, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You'll recall that the Gilgamesh epic was clearly assembled around the end of the Late Bronze Age, and perhaps the Early Iron Age in several stages and several versions, and our various creation epics likely contain similar compositional stages. Proposed Pentateuch sources like P and D are on extremely solid footing. But everything else around how the various sources came together and what exact context they were written in and what their original contents were, it does have to be understood as living at slightly lower levels of probability, open to argument and change, as I briefly referenced earlier. In the latter half of the 20th century, a previously less prominent view started to take hold in what scholars refer to as the field of Pentateuchal source criticism, first in Europe, before recently making its way over to America. It questions whether J and E are really coherent sources all the way through, and imagines different processes for how the rather lengthy work of the Torah came together. This is broadly categorized under the umbrella of the supplementary hypothesis. While some scholars see it as a break from the traditional view, others see it not as a refutation of the documentary hypothesis, but a competing evolution of it. After all, most supplementary scholars do still think P and D sources exist in the text. And classic documentary hypothesis supporters have themselves vacillated between new conceptions and arguments and sticking with the older model to greater or lesser degrees. And because some of the sources do get sort of patchy throughout, I see some of the point of the supplementarians. Baden's book takes them to task, sometimes unfairly, but I know that simpler models do tend to be more sustainable because they can at least imagine a coherent evolution with solid, visible, hypothesized sources. So I'm left mostly throwing my hands up and admitting it's beyond my abilities as a biblical studies wannabe to choose a side here. I probably tend towards the so-called neo-documentary hypothesis with J, E, D, and P, but I thought it worth pointing out that David Carr and several scholars I've had on the show and think highly of see things differently. What seems very obvious to me is that we are dealing with at least 4 sources. Some of these sources predate the others, obviously, and multiple compiled forms of this long narrative existed and were stitched together at the latest by the 200s BCE. That's about as far as I'll go. That's still hundreds of years away for us, unfortunately. And so, naturally, one of the other big arguments that has seen some scholars throw in the towel is dating. Both the dating of the Torah as a single unit and the dating of the composition of its sources. Obviously, I think some of the Torah has a clear 7th and maybe even 8th century BCE background, which makes me slam my head into the wall because I also see a lot of this as having been influenced by the Babylonian exile. Take the story of Babel. Traditionally ascribed to the Yahwist, J, one of our sources which is disputed to even exist by many scholars. But if it does, the Babel story is an important part of it. It's in Genesis 11, just before our first true patriarch, Abram, sets forth from Ur of the Chaldees, a reference to Babylon and specifically Iron Age Babylon. The Chaldeans did not exist in the Bronze Age. That's another division in the text, by the way. The mythological folklore leads to the big patriarchal folklore unit, which eventually transitions through Joseph to Egypt and the Moses stories and law codes and all of that stuff. But our first sort of unit in the Torah is this early, mostly otherwise forgotten by the Bible mythology in Genesis 1 through 11, split between P and J. Some scholars refer to it as the primeval history, a somewhat repetitive patchwork of various myths that often see close interaction between the God, referred to here as Yahweh, and the people of the world, especially in the stories traditionally attributed to the J and E sources, and particularly in J. In J, Yahweh speaks with his people as gods speak with men in much of this kind of heightened mythology of the era, where figures of great antiquity had direct conversations with the divine. So let's go through Genesis 1 through 11 and talk about the different sources and what happens in this story. It starts with the priestly accounts, divine fiat creation, all of that good stuff we talked about earlier, which is quickly forgotten when God creates the world again in chapter 2, part of the J source, as replete as it is with God's direct interaction with humans. Adam and Eve get booted from the garden in chapter 3. Cain kills Abel, speaks with Yahweh, and becomes the founder of the Kenites in chapter 4's J section, while a linking genealogy from P in chapter 4 traces us down a familial line that includes Enoch, whose fate is ambiguous and may point to him being allowed to live among the gods. This gives way to chapters 6 through 9, dealing with Noah, the flood, and Noah's founding of agriculture. The two accounts of P and J are interwoven in the Noah and flood story, with P being a little bit more programmatic. After the flood accounts in Genesis 10, we get what we've called in the show the Table of Nations, something I've discussed before. It details all the various known peoples of the earth, and the genealogy seems to switch back and forth between P and J. This is the first truly boring part of the Bible. But before chapter 11 can continue with these descendants of Noah and the genealogies that lead to Abraham, the list is interrupted by one last piece of mythology. If your head is spinning with P's and J's, that's normal, by the way. It's not quite as bad as the Joseph story, but it can be a bit nauseating. Anyway, we get interrupted this one last time in the primeval history by the so-called Tower of Babel story. For how famous it is, it's extremely short. I'll read the whole thing, quote from Genesis 11. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." Bricks served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build a city. Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." Yahweh came down to look at the city and tower that man had built, and Yahweh said, "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us, then, go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there Yahweh confounded the speech of the whole earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them from the face of the whole earth. So there are a few things to note here. First and foremost is that this is an etiology for why Babylon is called Babylon. Balal, the Hebrew word translated as confounded, sounds kind of like Babel. Like the hunter Nimrod who appears just before this and who represents the Assyrian kings who portrayed themselves as great hunters of lions, the author of this passage is familiar with the fact that the Babylonians and Mesopotamians more broadly were famed as building their cities and walls and great structures with bricks and bitumen, instead of the stone that was more common in Palestinian architecture. And obviously this story is famous because it's also an etiology for why humans all speak different languages. That much should be clear. But there's even more going on here. Just 2 verses earlier, at the end of one part of the lengthy genealogies, we get this first quote. "These are the descendants of Shem, by their families, their languages, their lands, and their peoples." And that means Babel is quite the narrative break as we go from many peoples with many languages back to a single language in the Babel story. But let's not stop there. The Babel story also has Yahweh addressing his council of gods, saying, "Let us go down and confound their speech," addressing the council of the gods and requesting their aid in scattering the people. This might make one assume that this is a rather old myth that was passed down from a time long before Ezekiel and Josiah and their ranting against the other gods, but that's not entirely accurate.
Excuse me, Mr. President. That's not entirely accurate.
Probably. This is where we have to discuss the titular Tower of Babel. Keener listeners will notice that this story seems reminiscent of myths like the killing of Enkidu by the gods in the Gilgamesh epic, in that the point of the story is not that the tower is so tall that it can breach into the domain of the gods literally, but that it demonstrates an ability of humans to become as powerful as the gods, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu threaten to become when they kill Humbaba and fell the mighty cedars on the sacred mountain and make a name for themselves. The gods, as you'll recall from my recent episode with Eric Harvey, need humans to tend their fields and feed them, and it's that human unity and solidarity and cooperation that Yahweh notes threatens to upend the status quo, not the act of building the tower itself. The tower is done by the time the gods intervene. This is clearly similar to J material in Genesis, at least in the primeval history, where Yahweh interacts with humans in a very specific and tactile way. He talks to them. He references them directly. He intervenes. It imagines, even in its sparse words, this council and discussion like the Atrahasis flood epic and the gods deciding to kill Enkidu and Gilgamesh. The tower, curiously, actually only gets mentioned twice compared to the city, which is the main focus of the story. But the tower being in Babylon might help us to place the story in real historical time, maybe. While Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar knocked down the last of the Assyrian Empire, their builders in the new Babylonian dynasty had set to work in restoring the splendor of old Babylon, something Saddam Hussein, oddly enough, also used as a propagandistic motif. And one of the ways that Nebuchadnezzar did this was to continue restoring the famed glory of the city as a whole, and especially Etemenanke, arguably the greatest of the pyramidal ziggurats of Babylon, devoted to Marduk himself. The colossal structure of Etemenanke in the center of the city had begun its life sometime in the late Bronze Age, around the time of the composition of Enuma Elish, the creation myth composed to venerate Marduk as the new head of the gods, the new Enlil. At the end of that tale, Marduk frees the gods from Tiamat's terror, and in return, they promise to build him a great home. Quote from the Enuma Elish. When Marduk heard this, his face lit up greatly, like daylight. Create Babylon, whose construction you requested. Let its mud bricks be molded, and build high the shrine. The Anunnaki began shoveling. For a whole year they made bricks for it. When the second year arrived, they had raised the top of Esagila in front of the Apsu. They had built a high ziggurat for the Apsu. They founded a dwelling for Anu, Enlil, and Ea likewise. Even the Anunnaki are glad, as royal subjects should be, to be providing corvée labor for the king's monumental structure. This could itself be a reference to Etemenanke and its construction, but that part is uncertain. We don't know whether Enuma Elish or Etemenanke came first, because both were created at some point after Hammurabi's time and before the Bronze Age collapse. That's a half millennium or so date range for both of them. Etemenanke is probably the ziggurat in Enuma Elish, I'll admit it, but I can't back that up with anything but vibes. But it's got to be Etemenanke, right? Right? The Great Ziggurat was located in the middle of the vaguely rectangular city of Babylon, along the banks of the Euphrates, which divided the city in two. It's fitting that Esagil is named in Enuma Elish as well, as Marduk's great temple of that name stood next to the legendary tower. Herodotus, writing in the 400s, after Etemenanke had been restored, describes the enormous stepped pyramid like this. Quote, "The great wall I have described is the chief armor of the city, but there is a second one within it, hardly less strong though narrower. There is a fortress in the middle of each half of the city. In one, the royal palace surrounded by a wall of great strength. In the other, the temple of Bel, the Babylonian Zeus." Note, Bel is another name for Marduk. He's talking about Marduk here. "The temple is a square building, 2 furlongs each way, with bronze gates, and was still in existence in my time. It has a solid central tower, 1 furlong square, with a second erected on top of it, and then a third, and so on, up to 8. All 8 towers can be climbed by a spiral way running around the outside, and about halfway up there are seats and a shelter for those who make the ascent to rest on. On the summit of the topmost tower stands a great temple with a fine large couch in it, richly covered, and a golden table beside it. The shrine contains no image, and no one spends the night there except, as the Chaldeans who are priests of Bel say, one Assyrian woman all alone, whoever it may be that God has chosen. The Chaldeans also say, though I do not believe them, that the god enters the temple in person and takes his rest upon the bed." This would, again, be describing the restored version, but it follows the general pattern of ziggurats. Herodotus names 8 square layers, decreasing in area as you go up, and probably decreasing a bit in height as well. What he describes as a spiral are the switchback staircases that go up each level, of which there were probably 6 or fewer main floors, not 8. We should probably be cautious about Herodotus's recounting of some of the specifics, as he tends to bullshit a little and may never have actually visited Mesopotamia. But that aside, he mostly gets the details here correct. And while the general structure likely remained the same throughout its life, there's a reason it had to be restored by Nebuchadnezzar. because you'll remember that at the height of the Assyrian hegemony under Sennacherib, about a century before our current moment, the great king of Assyria lost his patience and destroyed Babylon. He even says that he completely destroyed Etemenanke, quote from his recounting of the campaign. I destroyed and tore down and burned with fire the city and its houses, from its foundations to its parapets. I tore out the inner and outer walls, temples, the ziggurat of brick and earth, as many as there were, and threw them into the Aratu River. And yeah, that part is probably not fully true. He almost certainly tore down a lot of it, but Etemenanke was an enormous structure, probably around 200 feet tall and just goddamn big. Herodotus may have his fibs and may creatively fill in details, but he's often got nothing on the boasts of Iron Age rulers. Those guys bullshitted hard. Sennacherib likely wrecked the temple on top and the Esagil temple next door, and he may have ordered the tearing down of staircases and probably seriously damaged the decorations and upper floors, but he couldn't have leveled it. Regardless of how badly he did or didn't damage it, under later Assyrian and Babylonian kings, the city was restored, and it did take a long, long time. It probably started in the mid-7th century under Esarhaddon and then Ashurbanipal, but was paused when the empire started to fall apart. The work started back up under the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar, late in his own time, was still having his crews work on it. Nebuchad puts it this way, quote, "The totality of the distant populations that Marduk had given to me, I set them to work on the Etemenanke and made them carry the brick baskets." And so, at the very least, Sennacherib had done quite a number on the great ziggurat of Babylon, and it took the better part of a century and the overthrow of the Assyrians to really get the city and its tower back in shape, all on the backs of the people Nebuchadnezzar had just reconquered. Maybe some of this chaos was behind our Babel story in Genesis, with the rise and fall of Assyria and then Babylon just a few decades after the tower had been rebuilt. In a neat little article on thetorah.com, Professor Takeyoshi Oshima notes that the Tower of Babel story might be referencing Enuma Elish even more directly, though. Quote, "In Enuma Elish, the city of Babylon, not the historical Babylon, but Marduk's mythological dominion built by the gods, consists of one skyscraper, Esagil. The Akkadian description of the tower in the text may be a gloss on the Sumerian name Esagil, which means house whose top is raised high. Quote, they raised the peak of Esagil. In this context, Genesis' description of the Tower of Babel as Rosho Bashamayim, with its head in heaven, does not simply refer to the tower's height, but is intended as an allusion to Enuma Elish and the importance of Esagil. And so it's possible that the Tower of Babel story, in referring to the tower as reaching its head into the heavens, is mocking the Babylonians' own creation myth. If so, the scattering at the end of the Babel story could be referring to the rapidly approaching overthrow of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which would put the story's creation after the exile. The Akidu New Year's Festival was probably the main event for Esagil, Marduk's temple, for centuries. Assyrian rulers who were Babyloniophiles, like Sargon II, would visit the city and participate in the rituals. After Assyria destroyed and then rebuilt the city in the 7th century, it started right back up, more Akidu festivals every year, and its importance reached new heights with the Neo-Babylonian rulers' restoration of the great city to the status of grand capital of the world, something that it hadn't had any claim to in nearly a millennium. Each year in the early spring, probably around April, the great creation myth was read aloud and potentially reenacted out in a dramatic cult festival that involved great merriment and deep reverences for the creator god, with a liturgy celebrating Marduk's power and sovereignty, especially elevated at a time where Marduk's earthly ruler now celebrated a new height for his divine patron in his own rule over the entirety of the Middle East. This was a time of transferal of hegemonic power, divine and real, from Assyria to Babylon, from Ashur to Marduk, the new and eternal god. Against all odds, the Babylonians had done it, and surely this new reign of Marduk would be as long as Ashur's under Assyria, or Enlil's under Old Babylon, or at least the olden days of the grand and shifting and more localized pantheon, right? Right? We're going to be around for a long time, right? And what's interesting about Enuma Elish's relationship with the Babel story is that it's, again, typically associated with the J source, which was dated by scholars in the last century to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE, a century or more before any of this ziggurat madness. The J source uses the name Yahweh frequently, as opposed to the Elohist or E source, which, regardless of one's view on the documentary's hypothesis, seems to stand out fairly clearly in Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. E, our last source here, is the one where Yahweh frequently reminds everybody that he's also El Shaddai, a reminder that some scholars think is out of place in a late context like the 7th or 6th centuries. Now, whether E and J even exist is up for debate, and whether they go beyond the point in the Exodus where the full conflation is made, or whether they were combined before being put into the Torah, these are all other debates among scholars. But no matter what, these materials are typically considered older than P. If the Babel story in J especially is older than P and contains a story that references the destruction of Babylon, whether by Sennacherib or by the coming Persians, that would mean that J would have to be written in the mid-7th century or later, and P would, well, have to be written sometime not only after these events, but also after the composition of the earlier sources, unless the distinctive story was a later addition to J, which, again, anything's possible. Anything's possible. This is the key problem. If the Torah only became known around the 2nd or late 3rd century, we have what is essentially a 600-year window in which various parts of it could have been written and combined, a window in which we get precious few attestations or quotes from the books themselves. We don't get to see shit for the process, literally just these 2 silver scrolls. Even if J was written in the 6th century, that's still 400 years. 400 years, one small silver grave amulet with a fairly generic blessing and some other material not in the Torah. That's all we've got. That's it. A point often made by Paul Davidson, my buddy over at the Inquisitive Bible Reader, is that it's possible to write archaically. Some of the Hebrew in the Torah is often considered a little later. It continued to be edited and changed even after the Dead Sea Scrolls period, and we get little evidence outside of circumstantial relation to things like Esarhaddon's succession treaty with which to confidently date it. I'm not saying that the Torah is all 5th, 4th, or 3rd century. Attempts at writing Hebrew archaically from that period often reveal themselves more flagrantly, something we'll see pretty clearly when we get to the book of Daniel. But we really cannot rule out that much of this did come into being around or just before that time period, in our present moment, in the 6th and 5th centuries, in the exile, or a little bit later. I don't think it's the most probable way to deal with all of the evidence, but I also don't think it's as unlikely as some folks will argue. There's something there, I just can't put my finger on it. Some way to untangle this goddamn Gordian knot before we have to cut it. Against some of the skeptics, though, I do tend to think of the Torah as something that starts in the 7th century or just before and morphs and grows over the couple centuries that followed, being combined at some definitive point into the general form of the Pentateuch that we all know and bash our heads over. A great example of the visibility of the entire composition process of the Torah and the confusion around it is found in the famous 10 Commandments.
The Lord has handed down to us 10 commandments by which to live. I will now read them in no particular order.
Today, a group of people scholars refer to with the technical term really stupid motherfuckers want to include the 10 Commandments outside of courthouses and schools and whatever. What's curious is that the 10 Commandments as a unit doesn't really exist in the Bible or in reality as a single stable thing, even in translation, and that's once again in part because there are multiple sources involved. In case you've forgotten what the 10 Commandments are, they're known in Hebrew as Asheret HaDevarim, literally the 10 words, Decalogue in Greek. It's a set of between 9 and 16 commandments that are divided up into 10 depending on one's textual tradition and religious community tradition. 10's an important number, it's a round number, it's divisible by 5. Nobody wants to hear about the 9 or 11 or 16 commandments, and so they divide them up accordingly into 10. The classical commandments are found in two places, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Friedman and Baden both posit that these are the works of a later hand, a late insertion that some scholars have posited serves as a prologue to the two different law codes that follow. The older covenant code, probably related to J and or E, and the Deuteronomistic code, which is D. Both versions of the Ten Commandments are presented at a point in the Moses story where he goes up onto the mountain to meet God, and they serve as a general prologue to the lengthier sets of laws that follow. In Exodus 20's case, these are the laws based on Hammurabi's code. The two sets of commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy are largely the same, with a few minor differences, particularly in two of the commandments. These are famous ones. You remember them. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make carved or graven images. You shall not make wrongful or careless use of the name of Yahweh. Honor or observe the Sabbath, depending on which one you're reading. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal.
Thou shalt not commit adultery.
Well, looks like the party's over.
Hey, Moses, keep 'em coming. Thou shalt not steal.
Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't covet your neighbor's house, woman, slaves, or cattle. Now, if we lump all of the don't covets together and see the first two commandments about having no other gods before me and not making idols as separate, then we get 10 commandments with a few subcommands. That's how the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of these books, handles this and divides them up, and it's probably the most elegant solution. But there's no real guide in the texts themselves, and so Catholics, Lutherans, the Christian writer Augustine, and the Jewish Talmud all divide the commandment numbers and texts up slightly differently, with a few variances in the order of the text even. The Talmud includes part of the prologue itself as one of the words. Literally, I am Yahweh your God is one of the Devarim. And what Christians consider the first two commandments get lumped together as one in this version. Of course, because Jews and Samaritans will eventually get into a big tiff and change the Torah in their own ways to suit their own needs and polemics around whether Jerusalem or Samaria was Yahweh's true home, the Samaritan Pentateuch consolidates a version similar to the Septuagint's, but adds a new final command. You shall set up these stones, which I command you today, on Mount Gerizim. And of course, you'll recall that that's the mountaintop shrine near Samaria. I'll put Wikipedia's chart that lays all the different divisions out in the Instagram post for this episode. I don't typically use Wikipedia much for researching the show, but Dan McClellan pointed out this chart a while ago, and I'd be a fool not to admit it's pretty helpful. Intriguingly, Exodus never refers to these as the Aserat HaDevarim. Deuteronomy does use the term 10 Commandments a bit before and a bit after this list, but never in the text of the list itself. There is, curiously, one list in the Bible that explicitly refers to itself as the 10 Commandments. It's just not the ones you're used to. All right, everyone, turn your Bibles a few pages forward in Exodus from chapter 20 to chapter 34. After Moses smashes the first set of tablets Yahweh has him write out, he commands him to write some more. Skip ahead to verse 28, and what do you see? Finally, we have those words, Aserat HaDevarim, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. Curiously, this comes at the end of these commands rather than at the beginning, and what the commands recount doesn't look too much like the commandments as we know them. Scholar Richard Friedman places these verses within J, while Baden claims it's a sort of mishmash of previous material by a much later hand, the redactor also known as R. Friedman supports his claim that it's in J by noting the emphasis on Yahweh's mercy. In the prelude to the text, he says, quote, Yahweh passed before Moses and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the 3rd and 4th generations. And Friedman points out that that kind of rhetoric is fairly unique to J and is not something found in P. P's God is not nearly as merciful as J's. P's God is very just. J's God is very merciful. Stuff like that. Baden counters that the texts of the commands themselves look like a mishmash of previous material from P, from J, from E, from D, from all over the place. And I think he has a point. It does seem to know P, the priestly source. And yet, maybe this is where the idea of 10 Commandments came from. Maybe this is the verse that first invented that concept, which was then borrowed by the later authors of the 10 Commandment prologues in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. That's possible. Either way, again, these are known as the ritual Decalogue, the ritual 10 Commandments, and here's what they are. Don't bow to other gods, don't make molten images of other gods. Pretty familiar so far. And then we shift. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. Every firstborn of the womb from cattle to people belongs to Yahweh. 6 days you shall work, on the 7th day you shall rest. Hey, that one's in the original 10 Commandments. Observe the festival of weeks. Don't offer the blood of Yahweh sacrificed on leavened bread. If the Passover sacrifice has any leftovers, burn them before morning comes. Bring the first and the best of the harvest to Yahweh's house to be eaten by the priests, Yahweh. And regardless of how we divide it up, the 10th final commandment is this: you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And hey, boiling the kid in a mother's milk command is what will eventually lead to a prohibition among Jews of eating dairy and meat together through a particularly creative interpretation of this enigmatic verse, which is why Jews don't eat cheeseburgers for the most part and don't have dairy-based sauces on meat sandwiches. Implications for modern dietary habits aside, there's a whole lot going on in these third 10 Commandments that I'll discuss at a later time because, well, there's another.
No, there is another.
Oh, I'm sorry. You thought we were done here? You thought that was the last set of 10 Commandments? Now flip your Bible back to Exodus 23, near the end of the Covenant Code, and what do you find mixed in with a bunch of other commands? 6 days shall you work, on the 7th you shall rest, avoid all other gods, observe the festival of unleavened bread, don't offer the blood of Yahweh sacrifice on leavened bread, bring the first and best of the harvest to Yahweh's house to be eaten by the priest, Yahweh, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's a lot of the stuff that made its way into Exodus 34. This one doesn't really claim to be the 10 Commandments, nor is it a list of 10 statements or words or whatever we call them, but it seems clear that the ritual Decalogue of Exodus 34 is in part based on this text. This is why I think Baden is probably right that a few other sections were combined to give us the ritual Decalogue. Anyway, this is also why people love to study and argue about the relationship between these different texts. It creates this grand puzzle that, barring some discovery even more ancient and magnificent than the Dead Sea Scrolls, we will never likely solve definitively. Source criticism of the Torah is like the problem of dark matter in astrophysics, if it had even less of a chance of ever being demonstrably solved. Whatever state the sources of the Torah were in at the time of Ezekiel and Jeremiah during the Babylonian exile, we can't really know. And how it all came together, we can't really know. We're not done with the composition of the Torah yet, not by a long shot. There's a whole lot more that I'll discuss over the coming episodes. But we should really view the exile, I think, as the period when a lot of this, whatever state it was in at the time, began to become something real. We can't say what state the documents were in, but several of them had probably existed in some form prior to the exile. And they're stories of a people in a land that wasn't their own, hoping for the Levantine land promised to their forefathers, became important to these people whose survivors had been taken from their own homes, their cities and towns and villages. Whether much of the Torah was written within the specific context of Babylonian exile is likewise unknowable. But the theme of building a new home in Haaretz HaMuftachat, the promised land as the Torah calls it, would have been a tangible and powerful metaphor for the exiles, some of whom were likely of northern extraction and already had a previous tale of exile from Samaria in their recent history. Like these people's parents and grandparents had gone through this, and then they'd gone through it again. Perhaps that's where our different layers come from, a previously used metaphor among the northern exiles made its way south to Jerusalem and became further emphasized, more deeply imbued with meaning, in the second cataclysm of the Jerusalem exile, the end of all of Yahweh's political dominion on earth. And I don't think recognizing this reality, this fracture in the text, devalues the Torah in any way. Nor does the fact that the multiple sources understand Yahweh and his covenant with his people in different, even conflicting ways. There is still so much intrigue and beauty and historical significance in these stories and treatises and poems, and yes, even bizarre and outdated law codes and boring genealogies. Probably half or more of the Pentateuch is comprised of cultic matters and law codes and covenant stuff, which, sure, it's not always the most enjoyable thing to sit down and read after a long day of work, but it does have a neat historical background and is rich in detail about what these elite scribes valued in cult and mythology, with real ritual meeting idealized settings in the telling of the way to properly serve their very patron god. Yahweh was probably represented by a standing stone and furniture and various decorations in the temple that had helped to set the divine scene to presence their chief deity, as Dan McClellan refers to the process of giving the god a physical channel. And so these early texts present at times a very physical and tangible God, especially in J, a God who can be seen and even regularly talked to. Like in the prophetic books, the authors have Yahweh directly orate through the words of these lengthy addresses and covenants, tying together the mythological dialogues with the legal language of the time in ways that probably had a fairly limited audience for reading, even if the words could be read aloud. Scribes in future generations of the Deuteronomistic Code would have lengthy treatises from their very God found in the words written in these texts, not in the arguments of prophetic writings, as important as those became, but put in the mouth of no less a founding figure than Moses himself, the heroic and even mythic father of many of these Yahwists. A man so holy that he had lengthy, regular conversations with their God. They supplemented this at some point with myths reaching back to the very beginning of creation, which would have been important for completing something truly ambitious, an attempt at a rather full narrative of creation preceding this founding of the people of all Israel, this new idea born of exile tying together the ethnic and the cultic. Which of the sources did it first, E or J or some other third thing, is probably beyond our ability to definitively conclude, but it influenced at least one other attempt to do the same thing, the priestly source, the lengthy and likely latest of our major Torah sources, the one that knows everything. There are many layers and proposed stages of redaction to the various sources and law codes, and a frustratingly large range of dates for every part of this process, and so at a certain point it becomes more interesting to me to try to understand what the authors of the text were thinking of when they wrote their works, where they lived, what scholars call their Sitz im Leben, their place in time and geography where they fit. That's a notoriously hard thing to do, and obviously always hypothetical, unless you have a text found in situ, which we don't. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls, that's all we've got. Still, the mockery of Babylon in the Babel story, supposedly belonging to the older J source, seems so fascinating to me for putting it in time. If the tower and city are so central to Babylonian identity, then it just has to be mocking the Neo-Babylonians. I just don't think the story hits very hard if it's not about the short rule of Nabopolassar's dynasty. If true, and that's a big if, but if true, J would have to be written after the exile, or at least this part of J, and that pushes P, the priestly source that knows all the others and tells the big long story, even further along. And the 10 Commandments, the 10 words or even 10 statements, in all three or more of its forms, the Decalogues, represent the kind of intrusion into the text and later interpolations that add to the chaos and make it harder to nail any of this down. Very clearly, revision and redaction and editing has been at work. Portions are paraphrased and repeated and contradicted. It's possible that some of these sources were even meant to replace or correct some of the older ones. And so, to summarize, in J, we've got a God who often deals directly with people, who communicates with them and walks with them and interacts with them in very tangible ways. In E, we've got a God who needs to be conflated with Yahweh, El Shaddai, the older God, probably our oldest source. In P, we've got this lengthy story that goes from the beginning to the end of the entire Torah, the one that ties it all together. And in D, we have Deuteronomy, that famous covenant that God makes directly with his people. This episode is my attempt to introduce you to this idea of multiple sources that will be with us for the rest of our time with the Bible. However this all happened, it was forgotten. Nobody recorded how it was put together. Nobody recorded what these older sources were. Scholars do their best to explore that and to hypothesize and to argue in very careful ways. But we're only working from those 2 little goddamn silver scrolls as we make our way through the exile and beyond. But the City and Tower of Babel story is not the only mockery of Babylon, nor the only Babylonian influence on the mythology and folklore and texts of the Bible. Next episode, we'll be diving into the rest of the exilic fingerprints on the Bible and pushing the story forward in time, hopefully killing our old pal Nebuchadnezzar as we run headlong into the end of the Babylonian Empire. Thanks again to all of my Patreon subscribers. You can join their ranks at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast, and I will see you next time on the Bible Lore Podcast.